ご来場の皆様にご連絡申し上げます。セッション開始のお時間となりましたが、開始まで今しばらくお待ちくださいませ。繰り返しとなりますが、ご来場の皆様にご連絡申し上げます。セッション開始のお時間となりましたが、開始まで今しばらくお待ちくださいませ。May I have your attention, please?
皆さん、まもなく午後のセッションが開始されます。どうぞお席にお着きになりお待ちください。
ご来場の皆様にご連絡申し上げます。もう間もなく次のセッションが開始いたします。お席におかけになってお待ちくださいませ。May I have your attention, please?
皆様、次のセッションが間もなく開始いたします。お席にお戻りになりお待ちください。ありがとうございます。
大変お待たせいたしました。ただいまよりプログラムを再開いたします。最終セッションは、グローバルアーキテクチャーの再構築は可能かです。ご登壇の皆様をご紹介申し上げます。モデレーターは、当研究所理事長、佐々江賢一郎が務めます。パネリストは、ジョシュア・ウォーカー様、ビル・エモット様、ビラハリ・コーシカン様、HK シン様です。ご登壇の皆様のご所属については、お手元のパンフレットをご覧ください。それでは、佐々江理事長、よろしくお願いいたします。
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope your stomach is filled with snacks or good lunch or empty, whatever. This session is final wrap-up sessions we have carried very active discussions yesterday and today, and I'm not going through all the individual issues here. Here I would like to talk about global architecture, what we could do to make the system better or working better together with friends and allies, not only friends and allies, even with opponents. Without any further ado, I'd like to quickly get into the question. There are basically three sets of questions I'd like to ask. One is we have discussed on the impact of Trump administrations, and we discussed on the some of the concern and opportunities. And so we would like to start from geopolitics. We have discussed on Ukraine, we have discussed on China, we have discussed about North Korea and other things that could include, of course, the relationship with friends and allies. So I'd like to start with, Mr. Joshua. You are American here, right? Okay, so you could go.
Do I have to answer for my sins of being an American? I usually get to represent Japan. Here I am going to be speaking from my perspective, both as a recovering academic and a recovering diplomat. You know, the elephant in the room is obviously Donald Trump and what that means for the next 4 years in the region. You can't talk about global architecture until you understand what one of the architects of that architecture is thinking. I think, number one, the big point to make is that we're only 2 weeks into the administration. We know very little about the foreign policy inclinations of this administration. What we have seen thus far has been very focused on domestic. I think that's going to continue. I honestly think that with the president coming back, given the grievances, given the clear indications he's given of what he wants to do, they're mostly focused on the domestic front. The good news to you all here is that when I look at the team that is being assembled on the national security side, on Asia in particular, these are not some of the people that we have seen, whether on January 6th or otherwise. So let me just at least give that as a good news to you. The bad news is there's going to be a lot of disruption. If it's simply the way Washington looks at things, you can look at the inauguration as a perfect example, right? We didn't get to see the full effect of the crowds because of the weather, but simply looking at the president and who was sitting behind him, it was not the normal cabinet secretary positions. It was billionaires. It were the people that are going to drive the technology of the future. And you can tell that as a businessman, Donald Trump has a very different perspective than many of the presidents that have come before. I think that's important from a global architecture point of view because it might mean that the president might listen to advice that is not coming from bureaucrats. It might be coming from Elon Musk. It might be coming from his family. That's not a statement of positive or negative, although many people who have focused on these things might think it is. I think this is something that we all need to consider and understand about what this administration looks like. It's interesting to listen to the Trump team. They don't call this Trump 2.0 because from their perspective, this is like 5.0. Because from their perspective, they didn't lose the last election. They've been preparing the whole time. And while last time they may not have been ready for it, this time they might be over ready for what comes next. The question then becomes, how does the rest of the world respond? And depending on where you sit, the perceptions of you, personality is going to matter more than ever before. I think the president has a proclivity towards the focus on the leader, less important whether or not you're a strong man and from an authoritarian state or a democracy and maybe you're weakened by the domestic politics. So the question becomes, all of us should be rooting for the success of the President of the United States, particularly in Tokyo, where the U.S.-Japan alliance has been the main pillar of security over the last 80 years. But those 80 years are now changing in dramatic ways. So whether it's in my office looking across the street at the United Nations, where the U.S. has a very different point of view, and I think Elise, who's coming in, the new ambassador to the UN, may be very different than the ambassadors we've had in the past, certainly those that have worked in the foreign service before. And so I think we should accept that and also understand that the public sector responsibility, the approach of a nation state itself is fundamentally changing. If you believe that the greatest competition that is coming in the future from a geopolitical point of view is between the US and China, it's actually not the US government versus the Chinese government, it's the US private sector versus the Chinese state and different functions of it. That has pretty significant consequences when you think about this region of the world, the way that Japan, the way that India, many of the other countries will be thinking about it. So I think that's the starting point for me. The second point that I'll end on before we go back to other pieces is, I think often the world focuses far too much attention on Washington, D.C. Now, as someone who grew up and spends a lot of time when I'm not in Hokkaido in D.C. thinking about these things, I love the attention that Japan gives to D.C., but it might be misguided. If I'm looking at the Trump administration, I think you should be looking to Florida. I think you should be looking to New York. You should be looking at Texas. That's where you're going to see the trend lines and the ideas there. I think sometimes the president would much rather have people visit Mar-a-Lago than the White House because he feels more comfortable. I also think that in general, the U.S. system is becoming more complicated. Governors have a larger role, particularly when it comes to economic security, investment areas, and private sector areas here. And I think also the way in which America is thinking about the world, the fact that the administration's most significant comments on foreign policy have focused on its near abroad, focused on Canada, Mexico, Panama, Greenland. I'm glad he's not wanting Hokkaido, but in many ways, this is the beginning of something. So I think we all need to understand that, the motivations behind it, and also understand that maybe the value system that we have created since the end of World War II, it's not that Donald Trump is destroying this on his own. He, in some ways, is a symptom of a much larger cause of dissatisfaction of Americans who think about the world in the same way or in a different way because they're aggrieved and they feel like they've gotten a raw deal. They don't feel like they've been part of the international system, and any type of globalization is bad. So I think that is important. And it's also then important to realize the way in which the new administration comes in feeling that they have an incredible mandate. Whether or not that's factually based on how many people voted, it is true that the Republican Party, which is Donald Trump's party, controls all the levers of national state power, other than in the state reaches and in the private sector. What is that going to mean? Stay tuned.
Okay, thank you. Before asking Bill to talk, Mr. Trump declared that he will be ending the war around the world. Do you think it's tenable? If it is not, do you think that we need to cooperate for the Trump to be successful in his mission?
Look, I think that, Victor Chow this morning on our panel focused on the fact that, he said this and it was 24 hours. Clearly we're past the 24-hour mark, but I would point to the Middle East and say there was a deal there. Whether the war is over, at least for the time being, there is a ceasefire there. I would bet that Trump is going to find a way of getting the U.S. out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, that could be really bad news to our friends in Europe, but I think the feeling is that's not our fight. In general, America is going to focus on what we believe is in our direct national interest, and I think many people in the new administration look at Ukraine as being superfluous to what's happening, versus the way that many people have been discussing it here, where Ukraine is a canary in the coal mine in the international system. I think that's just not where the president puts it, and I have to say, there are a large number of Americans who agree with him, who say, this is something that if the Europeans can't handle this after World War II, then what are we still doing here? And I think many in this part of the world would say, okay, Ukraine matters, but what matters more is what happens in Taiwan, what happens in the Korean Peninsula. And I think that the president has demonstrated that he's not all that interested in getting himself involved in military conflict. He's been very clear and very critical of things like the Iraq War, things like the Vietnam War. So I think that this is a very different approach, a very different way of looking at it. But again, part of this will come down to personality. I don't think he's going to be as hesitant to engage with Putin and others that he sees as strong leaders. And so I think the president is very interested in unorthodox, doing things that nobody else can do. If he can make a deal and he can be the one that gets credit for it, he will take advantage of that opportunity.
Thank you. In terms of whether we should keep the status quo or not, both Trump and Putin and Xi are anti-status quo. So getting into a very interesting period Bill, you have a comment, especially from European perspective. I mean, there are a lot of obviously stress and concern among NATO countries, and also Europe in general, and also specifically some countries are faced with tremendous domestic difficulties. What's your perspective on how to make Trump administration work better for the friendship and alliance with NATO and European allies?
Well, I think my perspective begins with, first of all, the general question. I'm not quite sure what the status quo is, so therefore I'm not quite sure who's for it or against it, because I think that is more up in the air and has been for some time than perhaps we generally think. The second part of my perspective is that I think you have to think of geopolitics. We're in, as Bilahari often writes and speaks, we're back in a period of the norm, great power competition, always normal. But what are these great powers? The fact is that the strong great power is the United States. Russia has had a desperately mistaken war in Ukraine, which has greatly weakened Russia, lost its position in Syria, absolutely weakened itself in all sorts of ways, and indeed humiliated itself in large respects. China is not in a good state. Xi Jinping has been, unsuccessful in many ways, in economic management especially. So we've got three great powers, but actually America is the stronger one of the three. So as we start looking at it, we have to say, actually, that's quite good. And the question then is, what can that strength be used for? Third framing point is that there are a lot of contradictions in the new administration. As Joshua said, at the inauguration behind Donald Trump were great billionaires. How did those billionaires become billionaires? One word answer: globalization. They are billionaires because of globalization. Elon Musk supremely so, with factories in Germany, in China, in the Netherlands, in Canada, with a global business of Starlink and so forth. These are people who actually depend on globalization. So how is the anti-globalization view going to be reconciled with that business interest is, I think, the great question around this administration. Next framing point is that I think it's salutary for us Europeans to come to Japan and to the rest of Asia to realize that actually here in Tokyo and in many parts of East Asia in particular, you're very used to Americans being essentially bullies, to beating you up over things, and having worked out how to live with that. We Europeans have romanticized our relationship with America, typically partly out of a European superiority complex, I would say, that they'll always be on our side. They may make some mistakes, but as Churchill said, you can always rely on the Americans to do the right thing once they've tried all the alternatives. And that's our European view. We do look at Trump now in a different way because we think that actually he may now be an enemy in certain senses. And what we have to see worked out, I mean, we don't have an alternative. We have to be friends with America. But we also know that he's declaring that he wants to seize Greenland from Denmark. He's also declaring he wants to put a universal import tariff on. Lecturing us about defense spending is easy. That's fine. That's actually not new. That's been happening for decades. And Putin as being the biggest pressure for us to increase defense spending, not Donald Trump. But the big question that we Europeans have to answer ourselves is he actually going to remain our friend and our ally? So how do we deal with that? I mean, I think clearly the playbook for dealing with Donald Trump is you have to deal with flattery. But you flatter him, but you do not make concessions, in my view. Flatter, but don't give way, because as soon as you give way, as the deal maker, he'll know he wants the next step, and then the step after that, and then the step after that. Flattery is fine, but don't make concessions. So at the IISS Shangri-La dialogue that will be in June, there will be an interesting juxtaposition. assuming that he still comes, the US Secretary of Defense is always the opening plenary session. So we will have very much the MAGA, Fox News MAGA Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Our keynote address will be the President of France, Emmanuel Macron. I will be very interested to see the contrast between and the exchange between those people and how it works. Now, Macron, of course, is coming because he now has plenty of time, because he's no longer got a job to do as President of France, because it's been taken over by the Parliament. But nonetheless, it will be an interesting juxtaposition. I would suggest that at the end of 4 years, we will still be allies, but we know that we have to bear in mind that there are some wounds to take on the way.
Thank you. So you suggest the European country to smile all the time and no rain check?
Well, I think that we will smile. In the case of my native country, Britain, we will invite him on a state visit and allow him to come to Buckingham Palace and all of that. But will we actually pay any prices, give any concessions? I would recommend keep it low.
All right, thank you, Bilahari-san, from not only from Singaporean perspective, but ASEAN and also South Asian in general, perspective, please.
Well, I'm not so sure I can, if it's just ASEAN, there's 10 countries, huh? So let me try to speak maybe from a small country perspective. I start from the premise there is only one America. And as Bill said, it's the strongest great power. And only America can do certain things. Therefore, since there's only one America, you calculate whether what it wants from you is worthwhile, whether the costs and benefits work out. And if they work out, if the sums come out right, you do it. If the sums don't come out right, you find a nice way of not doing it. Another way of saying this is that we have always dealt with America more on the basis of common interests rather than, as you said, Bill, romanticized common values. Right? And that perhaps makes it slightly easier. I didn't say easy, slightly easier to deal with a transactional Donald Trump. Let me add one more point to support or to extend what Josh said. It is a different America, but where the difference lies. From a geopolitical point of view, I think it lies with the end of the US-Soviet Cold War. After the Soviet Union imploded, the US faces no existential threat anywhere in the world. China is a formidable competitor, but that's not an existential threat. Russia is very dangerous, and it is an existential threat to Ukraine. It may be an existential threat to some parts of Europe, but not to America. And you could make a similar case for North Korea and Iran. So if there is no existential threat anywhere in the world, why should Americans, in the words of John F. Kennedy, pay any price, bear any burden to uphold international order? And in fact, from where I look, from my point of view, the foremost priorities of every American president since Bill Clinton have been domestic, with George W. Bush as a partial exception forced by 9/11. So there is, from where I sit looking at them with a different perspective, there's not that much difference between Biden and Trump in the sense that both are still engaged in the world, but there has been a unilateral, explicit redefinition of the terms of American engagement with the world under Donald Trump. It's not a retreat from the world. It's just that America will become far more discriminating about whether and how it gets involved. And of course, the guiding principle is American national interest, or to use his language, putting America first. So this is something that small countries have been used to. We have always lived with this America. We have managed to work with it quite well. We managed to work, and I think we can, provided we keep our heads and keep a cool head too, work with the new Trump administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilahari. I know that Singapore is very good at this art of the deal for many years, not to mention the Trump art of the deal. But let us talk a bit more about what he could do to the region later on. But perhaps, Hemant, you have something to say. You are pleased to see the Trump is coming back strongly in terms of Indians' multipolar independent policy as a friend.
Thank you, Ken. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Tokyo Global Dialogue. After listening to my fellow panelists and also to the conversations since yesterday, let me just once again underline that the United States has witnessed a watershed election. And also to say that Trump has transformed US domestic politics, and he has also promised to realign America's policy orientation towards the world. I won't go into the many aspects where he may, how he may look at foreign policy making and what he might pursue, but you can be sure that he will prioritize the primacy of America's global power, influence, and interests. And this is not an isolationist stance to my mind. Two aspects of Trump I'd like to pick on. And one is, and the most important one as far as global order is concerned, is that he's calling for an end to ongoing conflicts and preventing the outbreak of others. And that would be of benefit to global order if he's able to achieve what he sets as a goal. However, I would like to also put in a caveat that the path to peace and stability will not be easy, as great power rivalries and the interests of alliances remain key determinants in how things will change and how they might evolve. So from the perspective of where I come from, if durable peace is to ensue, it will need to be negotiated through dialogue and diplomacy, and it will not be imposed on the battlefield. So I've heard a lot of European colleagues commenting yesterday. I think the ball is in Europe's court. Now, any forward movement towards peace in Europe and the Middle East will have a positive impact on the Indo-Pacific. I say that particularly because the conflict in Europe has bled Russia, but it has also drained the strength of the Western alliance. China, on the other hand, has conserved its strength and consolidated its power. So any change in terms of the other conflict situations will bring about a positive rebalancing. I recall that the Indo-Pacific strategy was first outlined under Trump 1.0. Quad was also revived at that time. Hopefully, this strategy will return with greater vigor during Trump 2.0. And the initial indications are quite positive. Regional states in this part of the world will, of course, have to deal with the Trump effect. There will be no free passes and no free riding. The importance of national resilience to secure national interests will grow. I want to take you back to 2017 when Trump addressed the UN General Assembly, and something which gives you an indication of where his mindset is working from. He said, and I quote, "Our success depends on a coalition of strong and independent nations that embrace their sovereignty to promote security, prosperity, and peace for themselves and for the world." He went on quite at some length in that line. So let us see how things evolve from here on. I do believe in the meanwhile, as the US assesses its role in the international system anew, a global architecture that is more plurilateral could emerge, where like-minded nations come together on specific agendas. The Quad is an example. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think there was general views expressed about the hope for the Trump presidency, focusing on the positive possible impact of what he's going to accomplish. But we have to also pay attention to darker sides of his administration on the global impact. That is global governance related to multilateralism, like United Nations, international trade, climate change, human rights, and all this liberal agenda, which United States has on and off. It's different, but of entire post-war period, it has cherished and tried to develop, whether it is Democratic or Republican. But that part is quickly diminishing. So what do we do? What's the role of Global South and so forth? Perhaps I better ask Bilahari first on this point.
Again, let me say that I don't like the term Global South. Because
how do we call developing countries?
Well, that's better.
Okay.
But either term imposes a false coherence on what is a very diverse phenomenon. What they have in common is a certain mood. But mood is not any coherent collection of interests. I think I must have been in a previous life a very, very evil person. Because when I was reborn as a young Singapore diplomat, a lot of my earlier career has been was enmeshed in dealing with what we now call the Global South. And I can tell you there is no coherence in it except of that mood. Now that mood is important. I think you should understand that mood. But I think this idea of the Global South is taken much more seriously in the West than among those of us who are members of the Global South. Ambassador Singh may have a different view, but that's what I see. Now, that said, I think it's important to understand that mood. It's important when you try to operate in multilateral institutions like the UN, the whole UN system. It's important. But it is not the be-all and end-all, right? I think it's a bit condescending, actually, because the term Global South somehow has a slight connotation that we don't know our own national interests, right? The members of the Global South, among other things, differ vastly in the degree of their integration with the global economy, which is still intact, right? They differ vastly in their relationship with the major powers, whether it's US or China or Russia. In other words, something to be taken note of, but not to be the primary consideration in anybody's calculation of national interest. And from that point of view, how we will deal with international issues will vary from issue to issue, from country to country, under this umbrella term, the Global South, which to my mind is mainly of relevance in multilateral institutions like the UN, where you're trying to get out the votes for something. But even votes in the UN have an importance, but in proper perspective, in proper proportion. Thank you.
Well, let me ask you, when United Nations Security Council is not working well, and there is some effort underway for many years to reform and change it, do you think it's worthwhile for us to put a lot of energy to reform? Is that going to be successful?
Okay, put it this way. There's a lot of criticism of the UN Security Council over Ukraine, Gaza, right? These are not new criticisms, because the same criticisms occurred say over Iraq in 2003, and you can go back as long as you want. In fact, I don't agree that the UN Security Council is not working well. It's working as it was designed to work. That's why there is a veto for the permanent members. The veto is not ideal, but it is a practical compromise to make the UN work. It's the fuse box that blows in order to prevent an overload of the system and blowing up the whole system when the interest of major power is engaged. It's the price you pay to have any kind of Security Council rather than no Security Council. Now, is it going to be reformed in any substantive way? My answer, I think I was asked this at the last Tokyo Global Forum, and I'll give you the same answer, no. There will be no meaningful reform of the Security Council. Why? Because it's not in the interest of any of the 5 permanent members to reform it. And it's a tautological situation where you have got to get their agreement in order to get reform. And there have been many. Again, because of evils of my past life, I spent a lot of time in what I call the never-ending working group on Security Council reform. I think it's been going on for more than 30 years.
Never ending, never working.
It works a lot, or there's a lot of activity, right? And if I have a grandchild who's foolish enough to join the Singapore Diplomatic Service, no doubt the working group will still continue working. So frankly, I think it's something that we can try, but I wouldn't expend too much energy on it.
Well, always skeptical view about the possibility of reforming UN. Perhaps a person like, former ambassadors here might have something to ask you later on. But let's go to Hemant from your own perspective, not necessarily purely from Indian perspective, on the role of Global South, or whatever the terminology you use.
Thank you, Ken. Let me just quickly revert to what Ambassador Kausikan was saying, and I'd like to say that for India, mainstreaming the interests of the Global South is a very important part of its foreign policy platform, as is recourse to multilateralism and belief in the UN Charter. So to your point, Ken, let me say a few things. I think that the theme of this year's TGD, which is resilience, global resilience, reviving global resilience, it does indicate a certain nervousness about the precarious state of world order. But it can also be taken to signal a desire to circle the wagons around the status quo, retaining the privileges of a few. So from my perspective, let me share that the status quo is no longer aligned with the prospects for global resilience in the 21st century. We see multilateralism, which is gridlocked, needs root and branch reform. We also believe that I can say that a reformed system cannot be based on existing power structures or continuing efforts to perpetuate their dominance. It must incorporate more equitable and cooperative relations among nations. And I say that particularly because I won't go to developing nations, I'll stick with Global South. The nations of the Global South are the ones who need the UN the most. And they need the UN Charter-based global architecture the most. So the two other aspects which are going to impact resilience, one is re-globalization, which is already underway. And this has a stress on national interests and national identities while recognizing the need for transnational economic cooperation. So this reordering is already underway, and I think it will continue. And then there's another element on the resilience front, which is the increasing tension between diminishing unipolarity and growing multipolarity. Certainly a new global landscape is emerging, but we still see that a rising Asia continues to be underrepresented as a key determinant of world power. Now let me turn to this session's theme, which is reconstructing global architecture with a question mark. And I hope that this signals a desire to bring back greater inclusivity and cohesion to the Committee of Nations. Nonetheless, it's useful to recall what we are facing at the current juncture. What is the bedrock of global architecture? It's the nation state. Now, nations act primarily in their sovereign interests, but they also contribute to the collective actions for global good, which is why the multilateral system exists. So we must start with ending the series of multiplying violations of the principles of respect for sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and political independence of states. And that's important if we are going to preserve global order. The unfortunate reality of today is that we see statecraft, which is based on coercive power. Unilateral assertions largely prevail. Recourse to dialogue and diplomacy to settle disputes has waned. There is cooperation on global issues has weakened. And hopes for a more equitable and more democratic world have receded. There is continued hegemonic dominance of the great powers, their alliances, and spheres of influence. There is growing multipolarity on the one hand, but there's also weaker multilateralism on the other hand. The prevailing trend is to talk about upholding rules-based order while not hesitating to break the rules in practice whenever expedient, and also undermining multilateral institutions. Economic coercion and unilateral measures as an integral component of geopolitical strategy are extensively being practiced. Instruments of collective security are being employed and deployed in a manner that is not in accordance with the UN Charter. The West's Ukraine-related sanctions have caused substantial damage to the global monetary, financial, and trading system at the cost of the global South. So I'm not surprised that there's growing alienation and skepticism across broad segments and sections of the developing world or the global South. The search for alternatives is growing. Interest in BRICS is increasing. These are trends which really show, give you three conclusions from my side after looking at these trends. First is that the failure to uphold critical elements of international law opens the door to abandoning them entirely and can only lead to a more dangerous world. The second is that the challenge today is not so much of reconstructing global architecture, but of restoring universal adherence to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, respect for international law. There can be no exceptions, no veto powers, and the UN system must undergo root and branch reform. If we mainstream this perspective and engage in collective decision-making, including inclusively the nations of the Global South, we can impart greater balance and resilience to global order before it fragments further. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hemant. So you still have a hope for the UN reform, one way or another?
It's not the UN reform, it's a root and branch reform, and it's not, and not just the Security Council, but across the board. And for the reasons which I have already outlined, because the principles and purposes of the UN Charter are not being observed, and international law is also not being observed. So that is a fundamental belief, because for developing nations, and India is still 78 years old, 77 years old as a nation, multilateralism is at the root of defining a rules-based order in which we can progress and prosper.
Thank you. What about WTO, conventions and framework, and also Paris Agreement on climate change? You want to say something?
two-finger intervention.
Okay, all right.
I agree with everything that Ambassador Singh has said as an aspiration, right? Whether it is a practical proposition is an entirely different matter. Part of the problem, when we talk about rules-based order, and I think it's important to all of us in this room, represented in this room, we may use the same words, but we don't necessarily mean the same thing. We place different emphasis on different rules. We place different interpretations on different rules, on the same rules, right? And that's a reality. Multilateralism, international law, the UN system, the UN Charter, these are all very important things, but they are tools of statecraft. They are not always going to be the appropriate tools, and they are not always going to be tools that can be applied. And international law and multilateralism in general and the UN system must be premised, can only operate on the foundation of a stable balance of power. And that stable balance of power must be based on strong deterrence and adroit diplomacy.
Right, I think that's exactly the point. When there is a system working, there has to be some power supporting those systems. I think fundamental issue is that there is a lack of power collaboration among the major ones. So, what's the reaction, Bill, from your perspective?
Well, first of all, my first reaction is I agree entirely with the poverty of the phrase, the global south. I want to underline that as an old newspaper man, that this is a terrible headline in many ways. But secondly, I'm going to revert to my, although I play in geopolitics, in my core being, I think I'm an economist. And one of the realities of the current state of the world is that there are a lot of slogans there, one of which is deglobalization. During the early part of the computer revolution, a Nobel Prize winner, Bob Solow, came up with what was called the Solow paradox, that he said he could see the computer revolution everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And today, the reality is that you can see deglobalization everywhere except in the trade statistics. So remarkably, despite the fact that we have all sorts of protectionism, all sorts of defense of national interests, and obviously a lot of the use of phrases like deglobalization, decoupling, and so forth, actually world trade continues to grow quite strongly. And indeed, it grows even a little bit faster than world GDP. So the question is, what does this mean? Why is this? I think two things that are pertinent to this discussion. One is absolutely what Ambassador Singh says about multipolarity, that we do, while we see at a geopolitical level a certain unilateral behavior, the reality of the world is that what has developed is a world where there is a greater dispersion of economic and national power than in the past, and that world trade figures reflect that. Just looking at this region, the remarkable and important change is that after decades in which China outgrew everyone else and was the sort of hub, now there are faster growth rates than China in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Malaysia. Singapore I put in a different category, but even in the Philippines, that actually there's a rebalancing underway. Let's hope it continues. I'm not a foolish enough economist to forecast, but nonetheless, we're seeing a rebalancing because of this dispersion of economic power in the world, and that is what's driving the continued growth of global trade. The second thing that's driving it is that once you put up barriers, such as high tariffs on Chinese exports into the United States, commerce finds a way to get around those barriers and rethinks supply chains. So bilateral barriers simply force the river to go in a different direction, and get to the sea in a different way, but doesn't change the fundamental commercial aspiration. I think when you go to global architecture and institutions, which that is, I think that that has to reflect the reality of what bricks are there, what bricks, with a K, not the bricks organization, but what bricks and mortar are being existed, where is power, and what I think one sees in the economic and trade sphere is a proliferation of regional and mainly regional trade agreements that are replacing the WTO as the primary driver of rules agreement, agreement for rules and investment. And of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, is a prime and noble example of that. I think we are probably going to see a further development of that because there's no chance of the WTO working again for many reasons, not just America, in the way that it did. Now, those kind of regional agreements are going to be important, and then trans-regional agreements like the one that the European Union is just finalizing with Mercosur in Latin America. So I think that the world can reinvent its global architecture, partly from the bottom up, which comes back to why is the global south not a coherent idea? Because actually there are an enormous range of power, of extensive power and a range of interests that are involved, and that actually what's notable about the developments that I describe is the range of powers that now feel they have agency and influence and the ability to make more independent decisions. And I think we should absolutely all welcome that. When faced with a particular binary question, are you with us or against us over an issue, Ukraine or something, it can feel frustrating to the Western or European, the American or European policymaker or the Japanese policymaker. But actually, it's an extremely good thing that we're not dividing into a world of simple camps, and that actually there's a lot more powers with agency and influence, and we should seek to embrace that. In any architect trying to build a structure needs to go with the forces of the world as they are, rather than a top-down vision of how one would like it to be.
Well, thank you, Josh.
Well, clearly I'm more Japanese than American, given my restraint to do a lot more listening than talking. It's something that Americans are going to have to learn in some ways, but I also think that what I hear may not necessarily reflect the law of the jungle that we're about to see, right? And it's always been that way. I think one of the challenges that I think about is we're here in Japan. We're talking about the Indo-Pacific. I don't think Japan gets enough credit for having literally put words in the mouth of American diplomats, you know, the way that the Quad has come out. And so, yes, we can bemoan the UN, but I think, as I heard very well from our friend who works so long in the UN, it is set up to work the way it is. That is a reflection of the post-World War II world. It's now 80 years. It's time to move on. And that doesn't mean you need to get rid of the UN. It just means that when it comes to some of the major issues of the day, that may not be where they are. And I think that when you have a very pragmatic interest focus versus values-based focused administration, things are going to get done more quickly. They're going to be done on a bilateral level because that serves our interests much better as the bigger power. You know, double-clicking on the point that was made, one of the biggest differences this time around is not necessarily just Trump and his team being more prepared and being kind of ready to go on day one versus being surprised last time. It's also the state of the world. Europeans are in a totally different state. As you already mentioned, who's the leader of Europe? We can't find anyone to call at this point in time. Britain's no longer part of Europe. Germany's going through elections. France is going through it. If Italy is your strongest power and the prime minister of Italy is your greatest leader, good luck with that. And also one more thing. We have not talked at all on this panel about China. I'm surprised that most of this dialogue has been actually talking around the very basic and obvious question that we're debating in the US. And so if we are the only ones that are going to say it openly and directly, then being put in a binary, I get it, it makes sense. You want to call yourself whatever you want, but at the end of the day, if the two biggest players in the international system are heading towards a clash, whatever that clash looks like, where can we learn? And that's why, as someone who's dedicated my life to focus on U.S.-Japan relations, but not necessarily in the context of bilateral, I see Japan's role in the world, at the United Nations, in the Middle East, in the Global South, as being the greatest area of interest for the U.S. Because if the U.S. is going to focus on our individual interest, then in some ways, Japan is that great ally that both from a private sector point of view, Japanese companies can no longer grow in this day and age without being globalized. American companies still can in many ways. And given that we're a continental power with lots of resources, particularly on the energy side, as Russia has been cut off from the international system, as the Middle East continues to go through its maturations and trying to figure out what that's going to look like, I think Japan has an incentive on the issues that you already mentioned about climate, about some of these other issues that have become politicized in my country. We're going to need Japan more than ever. I would predict that the next 4 years will be the most consequential the international system has seen, not just because of a very strong president, but because in those 4 years, this is Japan's moment. If Japan does not seize this moment, not doing it like the superpowers might, then both demographically, economically, currently being part of the G7, Japan will no longer be part of the G7. You're going to have India, Indonesia, many of the countries we've been talking about in a broad context that will take their rightful place with the size and power. And again, one more pitch. We talk a lot about hard power, given that that's the nature of the geopolitics international order. I actually think Japan's greatest strength is on the soft power side. The question is, how do you translate that? It doesn't matter if you can't play, because the games and the rule of the system are set up to only focus on hard power. And I think that's where, whether it's small countries or whether it's countries like Japan that punch well above their weight in some areas, but well below their weight in other areas, it's time for us to reconsider that. And there's no better place to do that than here in Tokyo. I'll stop there.
Okay, you mentioned about the role of Japan, but before coming to that, may I ask you one question? There is a much discussion on U.S. politics and debates, how this administration will be, going on for the next 2 years or beyond that, 4 years after. In your sense that this is what tentative, I would say, deviations of political pendulum, or this is more structural? There is a new America. America will never go back to the original, political, situation we are familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, if you mean familiar, a Reagan Republican, that's gone. I think in many ways, the two political parties in the U.S. are shadows of themselves. That trend has been going on for a while. My friend and former boss, Ian Bremmer, talks a lot about the G0 world, where it's really much they're there now. And I think the challenge is, we don't know what the shape of the Democratic Party is going to look like. There's no one to oppose what Trump is proposing at this point. We'll see with the midterms. And I think in 4 years' time, whether it's J.D. Vance or some other standard bearer of Trump's version of the Republican Party, we're not sure what the debate is going to be. It seemed in the past you had this debate between kind of big government and small government. That's not what we're talking about. In some ways, watching the Republican Party doing what it's doing to the federal workers in D.C. right now is fundamentally different. So I think, in many ways, we talked about sovereign nations and the fact that there's only so much you can do in the internal maturations. I think one of the biggest challenges Japan has is it doesn't know how to use it. When I look at India and Modi and why he's so successful, he's mobilized the Indian diaspora community. And if you look at the tech leaders that were standing behind Trump, how many of those CEOs are Indian American? And are the Indians able to work with them? We don't see that on the Japanese side. You see it very successfully with the Koreans, you see it with others. So this isn't a statement about Japanese Americans per se, but it is saying the American system is a pay-to-play system. You have to be engaged in the game if you choose to take your hands off and not engage yourself. So I think hoping that things will go back, I think that world is over. And the question is, what's the world that Japan wants to be a part of? Because it wants to be part of a US-led center. I don't think it's about capabilities, it's about willingness. Does the American population want to be part of that system? And again, this does mirror some of the historical rhymes that we've had in the past. America certainly has a pendulum swing. You would not have Trump without Obama, you would not have Biden without Trump, and now you wouldn't have Trump without Biden. So that swing will continue. But the broad scope of the kind of end of history type of thing is marching onward. And I think the question is, how will things as they accelerate with technology and AI and competition in all those areas continue to move? And the question is, how will Japan embrace that? Because putting your head in the sand and wishing that things would go back, that's gone.
Well, okay. Perhaps Bill, you want to say something about what Japan can or should do for the betterment of the global structure, including the United States?
Well, first of all, let me just respond. I think what Japan does have to be influenced by the view about how fundamental is the change in America. So let me add something to what Joshua said. I think the key question, and it comes back to interests versus values, as Bilahari said, is really whether American interests are changing. Personally, I think that at a fundamental level they're not, but they're being expressed in new ways. And so I think the pendulum swings, but the interests are the constant. And I do think that America will continue to have a global interest. It will continue to have a fundamental interest in preventing China dominating the Indo-Pacific. And Japan's role in its own interests, reflecting its own interests, I think should reflect a sense of that long-term American positioning. What is Japan's greatest security threat and interest? It's clearly China, with North Korea and Russia second and third in some order. And what Japan has been doing in terms of setting up the defense build-up plan, in increasing its forward deployment of military forces, of clearly developing a greater contribution, both in hard power, but also critically in technology and intelligence over obviously a long development period, I think has to be the right long-term support of Japan's interests, and will align with American interests, I think, so that national security strategy has to be the fundamental guiding star, I think, for Japanese conduct, both in these 4 years and in whatever years come after that. So I actually don't think things change greatly from Japan's point of view. I think that security contribution, absolute focus on building deterrence and strengthening deterrence has to be a crucial thing. And then I do think maybe the extra thing that one shouldn't forget is that Japan's relationships in Southeast Asia and in other parts of East Asia are very crucial both for Japan and for that security strategy. And I think that the CPTPP was part of that. The relationship with the Philippines, building up the Philippines' capability has been important, but also investment in Indonesia, investment in other countries. And I think that Japan should continue to play a very strong regional role, both in building rules, but also in building capacity.
Thank you. Hemant, you want to speak about what Japan can do or should do?
Thank you, Ken. I just on a finer point with Ambassador Kausikan, I entirely agree with him that multilateralism doesn't exist for its own sake. And it requires great powers to be supporting and underpinning the multilateral system, which is not quite the case at the moment because there's a gridlock. But moving on, as far as Japan's role is concerned, it brings to mind that there was a very important enunciation of Japan's foreign policy principles a couple of years ago by Prime Minister Kishida. And I think if I can just jog your memory and outline a couple of points there, he said that there is respect for diversity, which is fundamental to driving the international community in the direction of cooperation rather than division and confrontation. He observed that rule-making must be undertaken through dialogue, inclusiveness and openness, and there must be equal partnership among nations. And so Japan seeks a world where diverse nations coexist and prosper together under the rule of law. This is a very fundamental Japanese position, which I think countries like India completely support in terms of the outlook, the broader outlook, and we do hope that this type of perspective is something which Japan will continue to bring through its diplomatic practice. The second element, as far as Japan is concerned, is the most worrying and imminent threats that we face today in this region are in the Indo-Pacific. And I think this calls for much stronger security partnership between Japan, India, members of the Quad, for advancing shared interests and anchoring stability in the region. The one thing which I'd like to point out in this regard is that Japan needs to decide whether it can buttress Indo-Pacific stability by engaging Western alliance frameworks alone. In my view, as a nation power, Japan needs to cast its net wider, and we hope it will.
Thank you, Hemant. On the last part, I can't agree with you more. I mean, Japanese foreign policy throughout the period after the war is based upon three things. One is alliance with the United States. Second one, we are a nation of Asia. The third one, Asia, we say Asia in the Pacific, the same things. And the third thing is we are a member of the international community. These three continue to be there. And I think depending on how the politics will be played out internationally, I think there could be some change of emphasis and so forth. But still, I think these three continue to be there. Bilahari-san, you want to speak, Steve? Okay.
Let me speak about how I see Japan's role, but in a broader context, building on something Bill said. Bill, you talked about the diffusion of economic power. Actually, you might as well talk about the diffusion of the concept of power, and therefore about a new concept of what it means to be, what a multi-world, polar world means. The kind of traditional concept of multipolarity is there are kind of fixed number of great powers that form the poles. But I think that's a bit obsolete concept. It's an obsolete concept because all of us have to deal with the major powers, particularly US and China. But all of us who are not major powers, which include Japan and Singapore and India, have concerns about one aspect of behavior or the other of all the traditional major powers, right? But we have to deal with them. At the same time, the international agenda has expanded widely. This old distinction between high power and low power is completely obsolete. So you have what I call a situation of dynamic multipolarity, where you have different coalitions of powers, big and small, forming around particular issues, dissolving and reforming in different combinations around other issues, and so on. And this is a situation where there is great opportunity for a country like Japan or India, but Japan in particular in Asia, to play a leading role. We saw a beginning of this in the first Trump administration. Mention has been made of the CPTPP. All right, Trump leaves the TPP for whatever reason, right? I think it was a mistake, but it's done. But Mr. Abe rallies countries and forms the CPTPP. That's a kind of coalition forming around a particular issue. And there can be others. And that's the kind of context that gives great opportunity to a country like Japan. The limitation is, of course, Mr. Abe is no longer with us, sadly. And it seems that for one thing we all fear in Southeast Asia is another situation where Japan sees a series of revolving prime ministers. You need leadership. And that's our concern, that there is this opportunity, but the internal political situation in Japan may not allow you to seize the opportunity to the full extent.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to have the audience asking questions or making comments on this conversation. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. Japan has been out from the Security Council as a non-permanent member of the. And then Japan has predicted that Japan will not run for 9 years to come. That will be the longest absence from the Security Council for Japan. And Japan is usually a silent member in the Security Council. But if we are out, we will go to be even more silent, I'm afraid. But actually, it's Japan's responsibility to activate the United Nations, I think. Then my idea is that I have learned quite a lot about the successful activity of Singapore in forming S5. Even with those small 5 countries, you can do something at the United Nations. So my idea is that we have to strengthen our relationship with the Southeast Asian countries. Not as ASEAN as a whole, but individually, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia. And then also, we can also have a good relation with India. Then we have to make some noise at the United Nations. My idea is that we should take an approach based on Model B, which was proposed in 2005. I remember that in 1957, then Prime Minister Kishi made a visit to South Asia and also Singapore. And then after that, he went to the United States to meet with Eisenhower. And he got the promise of revising security treaty between Japan and the United States. And then in that autumn, Japan was elected as a non-permanent member of the Security Council for the first time, within a year after being accepted at the United Nations. So the relationship, cementing the good relation with India or Southeast Asia and the United States are not contradictory to the active role at the United Nations. We should pursue all these things together.
Thank you. Other questions? Please.
Thank you for taking my question. Kaori Ida with NHK Public Broadcasting. Mr. Emmott, at the outset, you talked about the competition between the tech billionaires who have benefited from globalization and the anti-globalization MAGA team. From your perspective, from your vantage point, which side do you think will prevail, or at least has advantage today? Where do you think this competition will play out significantly? Is it on tariffs, on immigration policies, on AI regulations, or is there a blind spot that I'm missing? And also, what will be the implications for a country like Japan? And how does the US Steel, Nippon Steel deal fit in this broader globalization picture? Thank you.
Possibly 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, please.
My name is Shikata, Mitsubishi Company Fellow. Let me ask Mr. Walker and Ambassador Singh about IPEF. As far as I know, Donald Trump has not touched upon IPEF after his inauguration, but I'm afraid he may withdraw from IPEF. In such a case, what do you think IPEF will be? Japan should take the leadership in the same way as CPTPP, and the United States will be absent from multilateral frameworks in the Pacific. China is going to play a key role in RCEP. I don't think she belongs to TPP, but she's going to play a very key role. And India has withdrawn from RCEP, is not a member of CPTPP, will not be a member of CPTPP. So if the United States withdraw from IPEF, what will India do? Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
My name is Hara, former Japanese diplomat. I'd say in February, probably Prime Minister Ishiba will be visiting the United States and meet President Trump. Suppose you are the policy advisor to Ishiba, and from each of you, I'd like to hear what kind of specific policy recommendations do you like to offer for Prime Minister Ishiba, so that he can raise this policy to President Trump? Thank you.
Okay. Well, the last question, possibly. I put all this together. Okay, please. Sorry to keep you waiting.
Thank you for taking the question, Martin Huth from the Embassy of Germany. I noted in yesterday's panel, but also today, that when it comes to Japan and notably the European Union or Europeans, there is a bit of a different tonality and approach in talking about the US elections and the result of the elections. And that may have to do with the romantic relationship that we have had and that wasn't so prevalent in Asia. But the tonality is different. I think we are also going to witness a kind of international global competition for individual countries to get to some kind of agreement, you can call it deal, with the new master of the White House. And I'm wondering whether these two factors might actually drive us, in this case the Europeans and the Japanese, a little bit apart in this competition and different tonality and approach, or whether the things that bring us together in this situation, for example, the need to compensate and make up for some of the, and I would call it likely damage that is going to be caused in the international system, stopping of assistance to countries, withdrawal from international organizations, etc. We and Japan will have to work together, whether this force will be stronger and bring us more together, and there will be more potential for working together. So I'm a little bit divided in where the trajectory will actually go. And as I have the floor just on the UN, I would completely agree with you that we have not the best, but probably the only Security Council we can have, irrespective of whether it makes us happy or not. But you will have also noted that recently there has been a tremendous shift in, well, let's call it moral legitimacy that's moving from the Security Council to the General Assembly. You can respond to that, of course, that the Security Council doesn't need to care about this because that's where the power is. But I would nevertheless say it's a very interesting phenomenon to see this shift from the Security Council to the General Assembly. To Hemant, I would say, I mean, we both worked in the UN for many years. The UN is terribly slow, and you will recall great concepts that have been developed in the UN. Let's take the right to development and the responsibility to protect, and both concepts by now are actually dead because their own proponents terribly abused them. So that should give us a reason to take a look into the mirror and say, irrespective of what we think about the US and the big powers, etc., what we as the biggest fans of the multilateral system can do to improve. Thank you.
Okay, first and the last question about UN reform and Security Council. Perhaps, Bilahari, you want to respond to, because you expressed some negative views.
No, right? Not negative views. If you ask me, I think realistic views. If you ask me, should the Security Council be reformed? Of course. Will it be reformed? Of course not. Right? But I think you raised a very interesting point about the General Assembly, the gentleman from the German embassy. This is not new also. When the Security Council has been in deadlock, the General Assembly has, on one occasion at least, played a decisive role in substantive questions of peace and security. That is uniting for peace resolution. But that was a long time ago. And there was a kind of loophole that I think all the 5 permanent members took note of and will ensure will not happen again. But that said, I think you are right that the General Assembly is playing a greater role, but it is by design in the Charter, which is a sacred document or something, largely a performative role. Now, performance has a place in diplomacy, but performance is only performance. Let's not forget that.
Okay, the next one is this big tech and benefiting from globalizations and their problems. Perhaps Joshua or Bill?
No,
either way.
Very happy to have Joshua answer it. But,
You go ahead. Yeah.
I'll give my answer first. It's an excellent question. I think the fundamental interest of the tech billionaires is regulation. And that means, obviously, straightforwardly domestic American regulation. And in that, they are aligned with the deregulatory instincts of the Republican Party and with the task of eliminating what in the Republican Party and conservative parts of it are called the censorship industrial complex, namely any efforts to make the tech platforms take responsibility for what they publish and related aspects. And that's why Mark Zuckerberg has eliminated the fact checkers on his platforms, on Facebook. So I think that their principal interest in regulation, that also means they've got a secondary interest in trying to use US power to influence overseas regulation, and that we will see played out especially in negotiations between the United States and Europe, because their major regulatory headache is the European Union and the Digital Services Act in the European Union, which is taking a serious effort to try to introduce proper regulation for the tech platforms. Clearly, if they could dilute or weaken that thanks to American threats, they would like to. So I think that that's their primary interest. The second point about them is that they are principally services companies. So their interest is in globalization of services, of technology, principally. Elon Musk is a more complicated case because he is both a services business and a manufacturing business. Will he argue against tariffs and trade barriers on imported goods? I suspect that he could make a peace with those tariffs because a lot of his trade can be local, the Chinese production of Teslas being for sale outside the United States, domestic production being for inside the United States. So I think that he could probably adapt to a world of tariffs. So the fundamental clash about globalization, as seen by Donald Trump as being about manufacturing industry, about protecting the small part of the American economy that remains in manufacturing, and with the illusion, in my view, of seeking to expand it substantially, which is just not going to happen, but nonetheless, that's his political campaigning slogan. Then the battle will be not between those tech billionaires, but rather with other billionaires, which include Wall Street billionaires, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary above all, whose investment interests are more threatened by trade war and tariff barriers. So I think there will be a playing out of a kind of pro and anti-globalization thing, but it's not the tech billionaires who will be on that. Principally, it will be the other billionaires, in my view, who represent really the continued global interests of American business, which have international supply chains. Those international supply chains will be affected by tariffs. So the question is how that will be played out. If you come to Nippon Steel and US Steel, I think that this was a very unique case, an iconic brand. I think that there remains a 10% chance that a deal could be done if the proposal can be refashioned in a way that can appear to be a victory for Donald Trump. But I would give it only a 10% chance. Otherwise, I think Japanese business is back in the 1980s, where you invest inside the frontier, as with the transplant factories, as they used to be called, of the car manufacturers, Masayoshi Son is the pay-to-play example of Japanese business, and I think other businesses will need to do that. Final question, I'm just going to quickly answer, what would my recommendation be to Mr. Ishiba, because it brings to the EU-Japan thing. My recommendation to Mr. Ishiba, as long as he doesn't take Dan Snyder's recommendation that he should stay at home and not go, if he goes, he should say to Donald Trump, I'm absolutely aligned with you in defense. I'm going to build up our defense. I would like to get to bigger than 2%. But let me be very clear. If you put a tariff on Japanese exports into the US, that's your decision. That's your economic policy. I respect that. But we will put exactly the same tariff on American exports into Japan. And it will be totally reciprocal, is what he should say. And he should coordinate that message with the Europeans, who I believe will or should say the same thing.
Very interesting. Josh?
Sure, there are a few different things there.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave that one alone.
Yeah, please.
But I want to address the IPEF one. IPEF has no substance, so it doesn't matter who runs it, honestly. And I would just simply say that that's kind of the nature of the international order. Everything's watered down. So while I think it's great that India could run it, what does it actually mean, right? Just like the Quad, the whole value is being flexible on it. And I think, you know, it wasn't TPP. We needed something that the administration could tout as a win. So the question is just what comes next, right? On this whole debate, I'll simply double click on everything that Bill said, because my senpai is always right on these things. But just from an American perspective, I do think understanding the politics of this and just how billionaires are playing and paying to play. And I get the fact that Masayoshi Son may not be Japan's favorite savior, but if Elon Musk is the first buddy, I think you need that. And so part of my advice to Ishiba is you need to go listen to the people that know Donald Trump the best. Bring a really nice gift, right? So in addition to what Bill was talking about, what's a gift that's mutually beneficial? Of course, the military, but it's energy, right? Like Japan needs energy. It doesn't have any. America wants to drill, baby, drill. Why not make that connection and say, we're going to help you build out the infrastructure from Alaska, you don't need Russia anymore. Whether it's realistic or not, that's not the point. It's about how big the number looks and how great the prize is. And then, you know, kind of, I think in many ways, kento shimasu is the best phrase that Japanese have. I will seriously consider this, and then let them move on to other things. Like, do not get put in a position where you have to make a yes or no answer on anything. And of course, you know, I think Ishiba needs better advisors around him at a certain point. We need Japan to be stable. We heard about the role of Japan's prime ministers. So, you know, this is the only place in the world where somehow by being weaker, he's going to stay longer. So I think figuring out how to get a strong prime minister that can do things, it's critical, and I think this is a role we should all play in that area. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Hemant, do you want to say something at the end to give advice to Prime Minister?
Actually, Ken, if you allow me, I'll just respond to the two questions which were put to me.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So the first one was about IPEF. You know, India was never part of the trade pillar of IPEF. We were part of the secure supply chains and the climate change and those aspects. And I can tell you that part of this agenda is very much alive and very much progressing under the Quad, because the Quad is taking up these elements very seriously. The supply chain issue, the critical materials issue, the technology issues, the entire range of this side of economic security is a part of the Quad agenda. Also, we have a very healthy, positive relationship in terms of trade with the United States. It's our largest trade partner, and it's fairly balanced. So it's that's as far as the trade goes. The other question I think was about moral legitimacy. Okay, so I'd like to put it to you that it's absolutely right that the General Assembly has moral legitimacy. The United Nations has 193 members. Those members are not the 15 in the Security Council. They're not the G20. They're not the G7. It is the 193 nations which constitute the United Nations. So the aspect of moral legitimacy is with the entire international community. And international community is very loosely referred to these days. Generally, my colleagues from the West, they tend to say that this is the international community. No, but the international community is not the Western countries. There may be 35, 40 countries there in that grouping. The international community is the 193 nations, many of them developing. So I think that the way to bring this entire debate back in a certain sense, along with the moral legitimacy issue, is to go back to the founding principles of the United Nations, to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and to really talk about the universal principles of freedom from fear, freedom from want, and to get together once more to support that kind of aspiration. And much of that aspiration is being upheld today by the nations, the diversity of nations in the developing world. So I think the moral legitimacy of the GA is just about right.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this will be the end of discussion. Would you give a round of applause to the panelists? Thank you. Thank you so much.
モデレーターの笹江理事長、ありがとうございました。ご登壇の皆様に今一度拍手をお願いいたします。